It's pretty much a rule of thumb that when you're designing a logo or even a word mark, such as this, a masthead for a magazine, you would use Illustrator. Illustrator is strictly a vector program, and being a vector program, that allows us a lot of flexibility with the logo. When we're talking about magazines, the masthead is of course on the cover. It could be on promotional pieces, point of sale, and so on. And when we're working with a typeface to design, which in this case is a word mark, a masthead, we're not working so much with shapes and so on. We still want to manipulate. We want to be able to manipulate that typeface, the word mark, in ways that of course reflect the nature and style of the magazine. I have here just the word harbor. I'm using that as an example. I'm sure there's a harbor magazine out there, but I'm just testing out some typefaces here. So of course the selection of typeface is important. And I kind of chose some random ones here that I can work from, test out, change the case of, and so on. But you definitely want to remember that the typeface has a voice. So dependent on the subject matter of your magazine and the style of it and the design style you're going for, you want your typeface to be appropriate. So Illustrator is very much like InDesign in the sense that InDesign 2 is a vector program, where InDesign is, of course, its strong point really is working with type. Illustrator's strong point is working with shape and manipulating shape. So even though we're working with type, I can change this type to a shape, to a series of shapes really, by going to type and creating outlines. And then that allows me to make modifications to that type. For example, if I just wanted to make certain points a different shape, I can revise that quite easily. And the way I'm doing that is using the direct select cursor here, which InDesign also has. And we can do the steps we've done here in InDesign. However, Illustrator just allows us a little more flexibility when it gets into some more detailed modification of these letter forms, or in this case, now they're shapes. So we do use Illustrator typically for logo development. Now, what we want to do in this case, when you have the name of your magazine and you're trying to design that masthead, of course, you're considering the typeface, but you also want to be sure of the spatial aspects of that typeface, of that word mark. So I'm just going to work here with these second two. So I'll get rid of these. Now this one, for example, is Helvetica. And Helvetica, upon just typing it out, we saw this in our type lecture, the tracking and the kerning of Helvetica is, for the most part, a little unpleasant. We can see there's optically some uneven spacing here. So that's something that we would want to fix. So I'm going to choose a bold version of this Helvetica. And you'll notice Helvetica Bold is often used in logo development. I'll just choose a little bit of a larger, more bold version here. There we go. Now, as a word mark, what we're trying to do is create a more cohesive group with the type. We want to make sure that the type is, all of the spacing across the type is uniform, but we don't have to be so concerned in this case about true readability. As long as this is, of course, legible and it's pleasant in its spatial aspects, we don't have to treat the type as though it's going to be a paragraph or a line of type. So I can go in here, highlight it, and then I can do my option and left or right arrows to adjust the tracking. So I'm doing the left arrow to bring that in or close the tracking a bit. But with Helvetica, you can see where the R and B, for example, seem a little closer. Some aspects don't seem to share that spacing. That's where we'll go in. And we're just using our type tool. Go in and adjust the kerning there. So Option and holding Option down and moving my right arrow. I can also, of course, do that in the character settings. So if I go to Window and Type and Character, I can make those adjustments here as well. And what I'm changing right now is right here, the kerning, and I can do it by the presets, or I can highlight this and use my up and down arrow. I can change these and so on. But typically I go in there and I just hold Option down and I use my left and right arrows to adjust it. And sometimes you have to adjust some more than others, of course, but you're just trying to bring that more unified appearance to the letters. Now, when you're talking about a masthead, you want to consider the weight that it has with the type of photography that you might have on the front of the magazine, with the subject matter, of course, and magazine mastheads do have to maintain some aspect of clarity when they're, of course, amongst other magazines. So this just allows us a quick way of adjusting, changing that tracking, which is all space across the line. I'm holding Option, using my arrow keys, and of course adjusting when we need to the singular spaces between those letters. Now the other thing we can do is work with the case. So I'm just making a copy of this, holding my Option key down. So that's Option, click and drag, and if you add Shift, you'll keep it in line. And with that, I can go to the type menu and change case. So uppercase. Now that's going to be different letter forms. Now that they're uppercase, the spatial aspects may change, where letters weren't once touching, now they are. So we may have to adjust the kerning slightly. You still want to keep it a cohesive word mark, but you may have to adjust some aspects of the kerning. And it's recommended that with your magazine masthead, you do try upper and lowercase. This modern typeface here, this is Abril. This is often a typeface that is used for magazine covers. It's referred to as a fat face typeface. It's also a display typeface, modern typeface. And here we do have some spacing that needs to be adjusted, again, just to bring things slightly closer, but you're always trying to match the optical. Optically, the spacing should feel even, and it can take some time. You go back and forth and you zoom in and out. You want to make sure that at different sizes it feels correct, and then again trying an uppercase, and you just need to click on it, go to type, change case, uppercase, and then see how that appears. Usually with magazine covers and mastheads, uppercase type that sits well because of the nature of the page. It's typically up at the top, and because it's at the top, it's kind of sitting in the top of a box. So the uppercase is maintains a baseline, a consistent baseline, but also a consistent cap height, where here we have X height, cap height, X height, cap height. So that inconsistency on the top of a magazine can feel awkward, unless of course we have cell lines. Sometimes the date will be in that space, so you can put smaller content in there to fill that space and make it feel more appropriate at the top of the page. But again, you always want to make sure that you're using a typeface that reflects the voice and the content. And this one here, I can do a little bit of kerning adjustment, but you really want to be careful with that. You don't you don't want to be too open and you don't want to be too closed. So it's all dependent on the typeface, the letter forms, of course, the word that you're using. Sometimes the word itself has a sort of feel to it. If this was called, for example, a light magazine, maybe you'd use a typeface that feels lighter. But you have to be careful, because then when you're using a lighter typeface, like a thin, for example, if we look at this Helvetica, when you go too light, then you're taking that weight away, and that weight, that clarity. So there's, of course, different versions of typefaces. You have in Helvetica a lot of fonts, and a light will be just too light at the top of a page. So it's in situations like that where you have to consider, okay, well, the voice may match the subject matter. If this in fact was the word light, however, at the top of the page of a magazine, that probably wouldn't carry much weight itself. Now there's, of course, ways that we can adjust that or compensate for it. Often you'll see magazines with rules. So a rule, I'm going to go to my shape tool here, a rectangle, and a rule can bring some attention to an otherwise less, for lack of a better term, less heavy masthead. So even though we're utilizing the word light here, I can adjust this rule. I'm just using, again, my direct select cursor there. I'm going to do that again. I'm going to try and match this angle here. So I'm using essentially a design element to draw attention to or draw some weight to an otherwise lighter feeling masthead. And that's quite common. Also, on some magazines, you'll have some white space at the top of the magazine cover in order to allow a different kind of typeface like this, a lighter typeface, to stand out. However, you're normally working with imagery that's going to detract from that. So it really does come down to selecting your typeface. However, what's great about Illustrator beyond InDesign, although we can do all of this in InDesign, we have to remember we're creating something that would be expected in the brand assets of that magazine, would be expected to be a logo in proper file form. So typically that is Illustrator, an Illustrator AI or EPS. And that would mean that it would be in, you would actually send it out in outlines. So it wouldn't be editable type, it would be outlined type. So this is outlined type. And the other thing about that is we have the ability to revise this much easier than we could in InDesign. So for example, if this was my masthead, I decided I'm going to go with the uppercase fat face typeface. I'm just going to clean this up for a moment. I can make adjustments. Sometimes with a masthead, it's nice to make subtle adjustments like that we can, that differentiates it from just a word mark, from just type on the page. For example, when I change this to outlines, I can use my direct select cursor and I can go and maybe make just this letter. So what I'm doing is I'm using my direct select that allows me to select one anchor at a time, and I'm just dragging across the lower anchors of this letter, and they're the vector points that are creating it, and I can pull those down. I'm holding my shift key. So sometimes you see on magazines very subtle adjustments to the typeface, and then this might be a place where you put other administrative information. I'll just use a regular Helvetica here. And, you may do the date. But even that becomes part of the masthead. So you have to remember, okay, I'm going to adjust the tracking. I might do some adjustments to the kerning. Even though it's just the date, as part of the masthead, it really does become something that we need to pay attention to and adjust. And then size it down in a way that that type itself is aligning with certain aspects of the letters, not just dropping it in and hoping it fits. We really do have to understand that anything that interacts with and comes within the spatial aspects of this masthead really is part of the masthead. The other thing that you'll often notice with something like this, if you align a word to a specific area of this, if you align one aspect of type to an area of another aspect of type, you can possibly highlight aspects of the word that you don't want to. For example, here, if I get this set and I start aligning it to these two letters, I'm actually making the B and the O, so the word bow or whatever, that often that's thought of as a name or something, that'll highlight. So you start to see this often. Some viewers might see that before they see the whole word harbor, where in this case I brought the U down and now that highlights the OUR, hour. So we have to be careful when we are adjusting type, when we're placing type with type, how we're making other things stand out. And that's just something to watch for. For example, the word status. I believe this is a magazine now. There's probably several status magazines. But this is one where you might use an adjustment to stand off the us part. So if you're doing a magazine called Status and you want to have some aspect of, it's the status of a group or something, this is a way to highlight the word us within that overall word mark. So adjusting type is, of course, on a masthead, something you want to do subtly. You want to be very careful with it, but you can bring some distinction and differentiation into an otherwise standard word or even a more plain typeface. In this case, with the Helvetica, the uppercase Helvetica, again going to outlines, so Command-Shift-O will do that as well. Dependent on what you're trying to do, you can even do some stepping of the letters. So in this case, I'm going to ungroup these and Shift Select, and maybe I want to do a step. Depending on the title of my magazine, doing a slight step and then working with the shapes again. And you might put the date in here, you might put cell line, you can even do a shape up there. These are all things that we play with when you're working on a word mark logo, a masthead. You're always trying to bring that subtle differentiation in. This may not make sense because the word harbor is more of a singular word anyway. There's no root to it really. Neither har nor bor really mean anything, but this is the way we play around with mastheads, just making those subtle changes, those little differences. If you want, you don't always have to, but the first thing you want to do is make sure that you're choosing the appropriate typeface. Now, when we are working in Illustrator, the thing about saving it as a logo is because you're always trying to do things in terms of usage, production, quality, getting it into other programs such as Photoshop or Illustrator and so on. So in this case, we can actually just copy and paste right into InDesign. So if I wanted to use status, for example, I would have to go through a few steps first before it's ready for use. So I'm just going to set these aside. Now, if this was a true masthead sheet where I was properly creating the masthead, getting it set for usage in other applications of the overall brand, I would show it in color, I would show it in black. So if I wanted to choose a specific color, now these of course they can change per issue. Sometimes they never change. You know, for example, Rolling Stone magazine, the masthead is typically that red. But we always show color, black, and then we show light on dark. So in this case, I'm going to change that to white, grab a shape, and send that shape to the back. So this is something we've seen in InDesign as well. You can right click, arrange, send to back, and you of course want to indicate this is the light on dark usage. So this is a very introductory way of style guiding. When we create a style guide for a logo or a masthead, some style guides can be quite lengthy, but we would note that this is the color. If it was a specific Pantone color, we would note that color as well. We would note that this is strictly black. If there was a grayscale version, we would note that, and so on. You're always trying to make sure that you're keeping it foolproof for anyone that's referring to this document. Now, the other thing we can do, I'm going to copy this. We can consider minor effects. I do advise staying away from shadows, from actually creating, you know, a drop shadow on a magazine masthead. We've all seen drop shadows, of course, and we've seen where, you know, it can be done nicely, but typically that's something that we want to avoid. We want to be able to keep that so that it's a flat, we would call this a flat logo. However, sometimes you may want to do a slight gradient. So gradient, in Illustrator, you go to the gradient window, and if I click on this bar, now this is just going to be a white to black. I can do that, but you can see it's gradating separately each letter. So I've converted this to paths, converted it to outlines, we call it, by going to type and create outlines. But these are all separate shapes that are just grouped right now. If I go to object and compound path and make, that's going to make all of these act as a single shape. So that allows a smoother transition for that gradient. And then if I want different colors in that gradient, if I want to bring some actual light gray in here, I'll drag from my swatches just and drop on top of that white. So again, very subtle. Whenever you use even effects like this, you want to keep it very subtle. There's several ways that you can look at your masthead in as an element of design, but you have to remember that it's basically playing the role of title. And we have to be very careful not to overdo the masthead, not too many effects, because a masthead has to do a few things. Of course, it has to be able to be read easily. It has to be seen from a distance often. You don't want it to detract from cover content, so you want some simplicity to it. Often a magazine's masthead, that logo is going to be throughout the magazine as well, so you don't want something that's going to be busy in an otherwise clean layout. So several things to think about, but remembering that in Illustrator we can convert that type to paths, going to the create outlines, and then once we've done that, making some subtle changes can be actually quite, you can be quite creative with it, just again being subtle. Something like this doesn't even have to come down that far, just a little bit, and then working with the space you've created. When you work with the letters, you're actually, when you adjust the letters, you're often creating a new space that on a magazine masthead allows for some of that administrative content to come in. Otherwise, again, be very considerate of the typeface you're choosing. That's first. Make sure that your typeface reflects the voice of your magazine. From there, type it in, get it sized, and then you're good to go. Now, when it comes to bringing this into InDesign, I'm just going to group that. I'm going to make sure it's grouped, which it was turned into a compound path in this case. So that was where we went object compound path. And that makes several objects behave as a singular object. Even though they're not united, they're not touching one another, they're behaving as a single object. And then I can copy that, go to InDesign, paste, and it pastes right in.